In this live coding exercise, I'm going to demonstrate interfaces and polymorphism. My goal for this application is to create a logger. Logging is very important in applications. We often use logs to print the current state of the application, any variable values, error messages, sorts of things that allow us to debug our applications and see what's going on while we're running them. I'm going to declare a logging interface, and I'm going to create two different loggers that use that interface, that implement it. The first is going to be a console logger that just writes a message out to the console, and the second is going to be a file logger that's going to write it out to a file called log.txt. The first thing I need to do is declare an interface that represents the methods that the loggers are going to call. So I'm going to right click, say New, Item, I'm going to choose Interface, and I'm going to say iLogger. And in this logger, we're going to have one method. It's not going to return anything, so it will be void, and we'll call it write-to-log. And it's going to take in a string message. Now, because I'm in an interface, I can't write any code here. I'm going to close my method with a semicolon. This is just a contract. Now I want to create my classes that implement the logger. The first one is called the console logger. The console logger is going to implement iLogger. Using interfaces and later using inheritance, we always use a colon after the class name. And I'm going to say iLogger. Now if I try to build my application right now, it's not going to build. It says that your console logger does not implement the interface member write-to-log. As soon as you specify an interface, you must implement all of its methods and provide code. A couple ways I can do this. I could just manually type it out. That's a lot of work. I can right click it and say implement interface, and it will put a stub in there. My favorite though is after I say iLogger is to hit Control period, and that will drop open a little shortcut menu, and if I hit enter right after that, it'll drop it in. I don't have to touch the mouse at all. The console logger is just going to take the message and it's going to write it to the console window. No problem. The next class is going to be the file logger. Now we haven't covered how to read and write to files, so this is going to be a little bit new, but it's not that bad to understand. I'm going to call this one file logger. Again, we're going to implement iLogger. And then up here I'm going to put using system.io. IO stands for input output. It's where all your file access stuff lives. And I'm going to say var file writer equals file dot append text, and then it wants a path. And I'm not going to give it a path, I'm just going to give it a file name, log.txt. If I do this, it's going to put the file in the bin directory with the application. If you don't specify a path, it automatically puts you where the application is currently running from. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is write a line to the file. And look at that, it has a write line method just like the console. One of the nice things about .NET is that it's often very consistent in between classes. So we're going to say file writer.writeLine message. And whenever we're working with files, it's very important that we remember to close the file when we're done with it. So that should write to a file. There's one more piece before we go work with the program main. We need to create a class that's going to decide whether to use a console logger or whether to use a file logger. So I'm going to add this class, and I'm going to call this the iLogger factory. A factory class is a class whose job is to create new objects of a certain type that satisfy a certain interface. We're going to use our configuration file to determine which kind of logger we'd like to have. So my factory, I'm going to go ahead and make this static, and then I'm going to give it a static private variable that is of type iLogger. We're going to call it myLogger. And then I'm going to have a public method that our main is going to call. And it's going to return an iLogger. We're going to call it getLogger. And in a previous lecture, I briefly mentioned the singleton pattern. This is along the lines of what a singleton looks like. We're going to have a static logger. There can only be one of these in memory at a time, and that's fine, because once our app config tells us which logger we're going to use, it's not going to change. So the first thing I'm going to do is say if the logger is null, then we're going to check the configuration file and we're going to load it up. And then we're going to return it. If the logger's not null, if we've loaded it before, it's going to skip the if block and just return the logger. So it's going to be very efficient. Now we're going to read this value out of the app config. So let's jump over to the app config. And I've taken the liberty of adding an app settings section with a key called log type. And the value of this key is going to be C, which means console. If I change it to F, I want it to use the file logger. But let's grab this key value and go back to our factory. If we're going to read something out of the configuration file, we need the system.configuration namespace. So I'm going to right-click my references. I'm going to say add reference. I'm going to type config. I'm going to check the box on system.configuration and say OK. Now I can put my using statement at the top. And now I can finally use my configuration manager. So we're going to say string log type equals configuration manager app settings, and the key name is the log type. And then I'm going to say if the log type is equal to C, then myLogger is equal to a new console logger. myLogger is a type of iLogger. I'm assigning a console logger to it, and that's fine, because a console logger is an iLogger. It satisfies the interface. That is a core concept of polymorphism. And then let's say else if the log type is equal to F, then myLogger is equal to a new file logger. So now we've created a factory class that's either going to return us a console logger or a file logger. Now this is really cool because now when we go over to program main, all we have to do is create a variable of type iLogger and then ask the factory to get us a logger. The main method has no idea whether we're going to get a console logger or a file logger. It does not matter. My Java instructor likens this to sending your friend for a gallon of milk. When you say, hey, go get me a gallon of milk, you don't tell your friend, I want you to go get in the car, I want you to drive down to the corner store, I want you to take milk out of the fridge, take it up to the counter and pay for it, and then drive back, park the car, and hand me the milk. It's not necessary. It's none of your business. You can just say, hey, fetch me some milk. You don't care how they do it. You trust that they're going to do it in the appropriate way. It's the same for the main method. It creates an iLogger interface. It asks the factory, hey, give me something to log with. And then when I say log.write-to-log, hello world, the main method just assumes that it's going to be done. And if we happen to want to log our messages to a database someday, then we'll just add another class that implements iLogger, and we'll call it the database logger. We'll write all the database code in that class, we'll make a small tweak to our factory, but none of our other code will change. And if we had an application that had hundreds or thousands of classes that had loggers in them, we're now able to very easily add new loggers without having to change those thousands of classes, because all they know about is iLogger. That is the power of polymorphism. So let's see how we did. I'm going to build my application, and then I'm going to do the show all files, and I'm going to right click and open the folder in File Explorer, the bin folder. Let's drop into the debug, and here is our log application. Now the first time I run this, since it's pointed at the console, it should just print hello world out to the console, and it does. Now let's right click our configuration file. I'm going to open this in Notepad++, which is one of my favorite text editors. And I'm going to change my C to an F. And now it should write to a file. It shouldn't write to the console at all. So let's double click this. The application ran. It's just sitting here waiting for my console read line. And if we go back to our folder, there's now a file called log. That's a text file. I can double click this, and there is our hello world statement. I was able to switch from writing to a console to writing to a file without making any programming changes to the main method. The main method now references an interface instead of a specific concrete class. This makes swapping really safe and really easy. If I were to add a database logger and all of a sudden my code stopped working, there'd only be two places where I could have gone wrong, in the database logger or in the factory. None of the other code needs to change. That is the power of polymorphism.